I sat by the cabin window, staring at the snow-covered mountains in the distance. The soft hum of my daughter's laughter echoed from the other room, a sound that used to bring me peace. But now, it only reminded me of how empty my life had become. Since John, my husband, passed away 5 years ago, loneliness had wrapped itself around me like a heavy coat. I tried everything, traveling, volunteering, even joining a book club, but nothing could fill the void. "Mom, are you okay?" My daughter, Anna, popped her head into the room, her face glowing with happiness. "You're awfully quiet." I smiled weakly. "I'm fine, just enjoying the view. Jack and I are so glad you came with us. It wouldn't feel like New Year's without you." She disappeared back into the kitchen, leaving me alone with my thoughts.
Jack.
My son-in-law. He was the reason I felt so restless, so unlike myself. When Anna first married him 3 years ago, I barely paid him any attention. But this week, stuck together in this isolated cabin, I couldn't help but notice him. He was magnificent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a quiet confidence that made everyone around him feel safe. His laugh was deep and rumbling, like distant thunder, and his presence filled every room he entered. I hated myself for noticing, for thinking of him in ways I shouldn't. But I was a woman before I was anyone's mother-in-law, and the way my pulse quickened around him reminded me of that in the worst way. That evening, we gathered around the fireplace to watch the flames dance. Anna excused herself early, complaining of a headache. Jack and I stayed behind, the silence between us filled with the occasional crackle of the fire. "You don't talk much, do you?" Jack asked, his deep voice breaking the quiet. I shrugged. "Not much to say, I guess." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The firelight cast golden shadows across his face, making him look like something carved from marble. "I get it. Sometimes silence says more than words ever could." I nodded, unsure how to respond. The room felt smaller with just the two of us. "I've been meaning to thank you," he said suddenly. "For what?" "For raising Anna. She's an incredible woman, and that's because of you." His eyes softened, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. "She's lucky to have you," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. Jack smiled, and the air between us shifted. It wasn't just gratitude in his gaze, it was something deeper, something I couldn't name, but felt in my bones. "I'll head to bed," he said, standing up. "Good night, Evelyn." "Good night, Jack." He brushed past me, and for a split second, his hand grazed mine. It was accidental, but the warmth of his skin sent a jolt through me, igniting something I hadn't felt in years. I watched him leave, my heart pounding in my chest. Alone again, I stared into the fire, trying to convince myself that what I felt was harmless, just a flicker of longing born from years of loneliness. But deep down, I knew better. If you're drawn to complex, dramatic tales like this, make sure to like and subscribe to this channel for more beautiful stories. The next morning, I woke early, the cabin still quiet. The events of the previous night lingered in my mind, every detail replaying like a broken record. Jack's warm smile, the accidental touch of his hand, it all felt too vivid, too real. I tried to shake the thoughts away, convincing myself it was nothing. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I pulled on a sweater and padded into the kitchen. The aroma of fresh coffee greeted me, and to my surprise, Jack was already there, standing by the counter with a mug in hand. "Morning," he said, his voice low and warm. "Good morning," I replied, feeling suddenly self-conscious. He poured me a cup and slid it across the counter. "You're up early?" I couldn't sleep. "Same here." We sipped our coffee in silence, the only sound coming from the faint creak of the cabin settling in the cold. His presence was overwhelming, filling the small space in a way that made it hard to think clearly. "Do you miss him?" Jack's question caught me off guard.
Who? John.
Anna's told me a lot about him. He sounded like a great guy. The mention of my late husband sent a pang through my chest. "I do. Every day." Jack nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Losing someone like that changes you. I lost my dad when I was a kid. It still feels like there's a hole you can't quite fill no matter what. I looked at him, surprised by his vulnerability. It does. It's like you're carrying this weight that no one else can see. For a moment, the air between us felt heavier, charged with something unspoken. He reached across the counter, his hand brushing mine as he took my empty mug. The contact was brief, but it sent a shiver up my spine. "Thanks for sharing that," he said, his voice softer now. "It's not easy to talk about." "It's not," I admitted, feeling a strange sense of closeness to him. Later that afternoon, the three of us went for a walk through the snowy woods. Anna chatted happily, oblivious to the tension simmering beneath the surface. Jack walked beside me, his towering frame a comforting presence in the cold. At one point, Anna lagged behind to take photos of the scenery, leaving Jack and me alone on the trail. "You've been quiet all day," he said, glancing at me. "Just thinking." "About what?" I hesitated. About how different life would be if John were still here. About how lonely it gets sometimes. Jack stopped walking and turned to face me, his eyes searching mine. "You're not alone, Evelyn. You have Anna. You have people who care about you." His words hung in the air, their meaning unclear. Was he just being kind, or was there something more? I couldn't tell, but the way he looked at me made my pulse race. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Anna's voice broke the moment as she caught up to us, showing off the pictures she'd taken. Jack stepped back, the spell broken, but the memory of his words stayed with me for the rest of the day. That night, I stayed up late, unable to sleep. I wandered into the living room and found Jack sitting by the fireplace, a glass of whiskey in hand. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, his tone easy. I shook my head and sat down across from him. The firelight danced across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw and the warmth in his eyes. "I've been thinking," he said after a long silence. "About what?" "About how hard it must be for you. Losing John, being alone all this time." His words hit me harder than I expected. I looked away, focusing on the flames. "It's not easy. I don't think you give yourself enough credit. You're strong, Evelyn. More than you know." I turned back to him, caught off guard by the sincerity in his voice.
"Thank you, Jack."
"That means a lot." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with something I couldn't quite name. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving mine. "You deserve to feel cared for," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I thought he might reach for me, but instead, he leaned back, breaking the tension. "I should get some sleep," he said, standing up. "Good night, Evelyn." "Good night, Jack," I replied, my voice trembling. As he disappeared down the hall, I stayed by the fire, my mind racing. I knew I should feel ashamed of the way my heart fluttered around him, but I couldn't help it. For the first time in years, I felt alive. Don't miss the twists and turns in this gripping story. Like and subscribe to stay tuned. The cabin was silent, the kind of quiet that only comes in the dead of night. I couldn't sleep, my thoughts a tangled mess of emotions and forbidden desires. Jack's words from earlier echoed in my mind. "You deserve to feel cared for." Those words had unraveled something inside me, something I'd buried for years. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and stepped outside. The crisp night air bit at my skin, but I welcomed the chill. The snow-covered ground sparkled under the moonlight, and the outdoor hot tub at the edge of the deck steamed invitingly. To my surprise, Jack was already there, reclining in the bubbling water, his head tilted back, eyes closed. The muscles in his broad shoulders glistened under the soft glow of the porch light. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. He opened his eyes and spotted me. "Couldn't sleep?" "No," I said, my voice shaky. "Join me," he offered, his tone casual, but the intensity in his gaze was anything but. I hesitated, the weight of my conscience battling with the pull of my emotions. But before I could stop myself, I nodded. "Just for a minute." I stepped into the water, the warmth enveloping me. The tub was large, but it felt impossibly small with Jack so close. His presence was overwhelming, the air between us thick with tension. For a while, we sat in silence, the only sounds the gentle bubbling of the water and the occasional whisper of the wind. "Evelyn," he said finally, his voice low. I turned to him, my heart racing. "Yes." He hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but I feel like there's something unspoken between us." My breath caught. He was saying it out loud, the thing we'd both been avoiding but couldn't deny. "Jack, we can't," I started, but the words felt hollow even as I said them. "I know," he said, his voice soft. "But it doesn't change how I feel." "How do you feel?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine. "Drawn to you. In a way I can't explain and shouldn't feel. But it's there, and I know you feel it too." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. "Jack, this is wrong. You're my son-in-law. Anna." He reached out, his hand brushing against mine under the water. "I would never hurt her. But this connection between us, it's real." I want to pull away, to tell him to stop, but my body betrayed me. I didn't move, didn't speak, as he leaned closer, his lips inches from mine. The world seemed to stand still as he kissed me, his lips soft and warm against mine. The kiss was tentative at first, as if we were both testing the boundaries of this forbidden moment. But then it deepened, and all the loneliness, the longing, and the desire I'd been suppressing surged to the surface. When we finally pulled apart, I couldn't look at him. The weight of what we'd done crushed me. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Don't be," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I meant every second of it." I stood abruptly, wrapping the blanket around me. "I can't do this, Jack. We can't do this." I fled inside, my heart racing and my mind in turmoil. I wanted to blame him, to make him the villain in this story, but I couldn't. The truth was, I wanted it just as much as he did. And that terrified me. The next morning, I avoided him. I stayed in my room, feigning a headache when Anna came to check on me. But I could feel his presence, his eyes on me whenever we crossed paths. By afternoon, Anna had noticed the tension. "Is something wrong between you and Jack?" she asked, her brows furrowed in concern. "No, of course not," I lied, forcing a smile. "Why would you think that?" She shrugged. "I don't know. He's been quiet today and you seem off." I shook my head. "I'm just tired. That's all." But her words stayed with me, a reminder of the precarious line we were walking. If she ever found out what had happened between us, it would destroy her and us. If you're captivated by this unfolding story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more intense, dramatic tales like this. I couldn't avoid him forever. Jack was everywhere, his presence filling every corner of the cabin, his gaze heavy on me whenever we were in the same room. Anna was oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface, her cheerful energy a stark contrast to the tension between us. That evening, we gathered in the living room to celebrate the new year. Anna had decorated the cabin with string lights, and a bottle of champagne chilled on the table. She sat curled up on the couch, scrolling through her phone, while Jack and I lingered in the kitchen. "You've been avoiding me," he said softly, his voice low enough that Anna couldn't hear. "I've had to," I whispered back, not meeting his eyes. "We need to talk, Evelyn. This thing between us, we can't just pretend it didn't happen." I turned to him, my heart pounding. "Jack, it was a mistake. A terrible, terrible mistake." "Was it?" he asked, stepping closer. "Yes," I insisted, though my voice wavered. "You're my son-in-law. We're family. This can't happen again." He stared at me, his expression conflicted. "I don't want to hurt Anna. But I can't just turn off what I feel for you. Can you?" His question hung in the air, and I hated how much I hesitated before answering. "We don't have a choice." The countdown to midnight began, and we gathered around the TV to watch the ball drop in Times Square. Anna was giddy, pouring champagne for all of us. I held my glass, but I couldn't drink. My stomach churned with guilt and anxiety. As the countdown reached its final seconds, Anna pulled Jack into a kiss. I turned away, unable to watch. The scene felt too intimate, too personal, like a cruel reminder of everything I could never have. "Happy New Year, Mom," Anna said, breaking my thoughts. She wrapped her arms around me in a tight hug, her joy infectious despite my inner turmoil. "Happy New Year, sweetheart," I murmured, forcing a smile. Jack's eyes met mine over her shoulder, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to stop. There was something unspoken in his gaze, a promise or a question. I couldn't tell which. Later that night, I went outside for some air. The cold bit at my skin, but it was a welcome distraction from the chaos in my mind. The snow-covered woods stretched out before me, peaceful and serene, a sharp contrast to the storm inside me. "I thought I might find you here." Jack's voice startled me, and I turned to see him standing a few feet away. He was wearing a heavy coat, his breath visible in the cold night air. "You shouldn't be here," I said, my voice trembling. "We can't keep avoiding this, Evelyn," he said, stepping closer. "We need to figure out what happens next." "Nothing happens next," I insisted.
This ends here, Jack.
"It has to." "Does it?" he asked, his voice soft but firm.
Because I can't stop thinking about you.
"I've tried, but I can't." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "Don't do this. Don't make this harder than it already is." "You're not alone, Evelyn," he said, his voice breaking. "You don't have to be." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. For years, I'd felt invisible, like a ghost drifting through life. And here was Jack, seeing me in a way no one else had. But the price of that connection was too high. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "But I can't." I turned and walked back inside, leaving him standing in the snow. The next morning, Jack and Anna packed up their things to head home. The car was loaded, and Anna hugged me tightly before climbing into the passenger seat. "Take care of yourself, Mom," she said, her eyes warm and loving. "I will," I promised, forcing a smile. Jack stood by the driver's side, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything, but his eyes lingered on mine for a moment too long. Then he got in the car, and they drove away, leaving me alone in the silent cabin. As I watched them disappear down the snowy road, I felt a mix of relief and heartbreak. I knew I'd made the right decision, but it didn't make the ache any less. Life is full of complex emotions and choices. If you've enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more dramatic and heartfelt tales.